The year was 2187 and humanity had finally achieved what so many thought impossible, which was integration into the galactic community, and Earth's star systems buzzed with alien vessels and trade routes, crisscrossed the void, and humanity stood, shoulder to shoulder with species from across the cosmos, but not everyone welcomed the new reality, and in the sprawling metropolis of New Atlanta, which was Earth's fastest-growing city, tensions simmered beneath the gleaming towers and magnetic transit systems, and the city had become a nexus for interstellar commerce, drawing beings from hundreds of worlds. Yet some humans clung to old prejudices, and their hatred finding new targets in both alien and human alike. Maya Carter was 16 years old with dark brown skin and intelligent eyes that reflected the city lights, and she walked home from the Quantum Computing Academy, where she studied advanced mathematics, and she wore her school uniform proudly with the silver emblem marking her as one of Earth's brightest students, and her neural implant hummed softly behind her ear, processing the day's lessons on multidimensional calculus, and the magnetic train platform loomed ahead, suspended 30 meters above the ground. And Maya checked her wrist display showing 6:47 p.m. And the next express train would arrive in 13 minutes. She never saw them coming, and 3 figures materialized from the shadows near the platform stairs, and they wore civilian clothes. But Maya's implant immediately flagged the neural signatures showing law enforcement officers off duty, and her heart rate spiked as they moved to block her path, and the tallest one said, "Hold it right there," with his hand resting on a plasma stunner, and his name badge read, Officer Dale Morris, and the other 2 flanked her being Officers Kyle Bennett and Greg Sullivan. Maya asked, "What's the problem?" And her voice remained steady, though fear coiled in her stomach, and she knew these types, and everyone in New Atlanta knew about the rogue faction within the police force being officers who'd never accepted the New World Order. And Morris said they had reports of thefts in this sector with his eyes cold, and he said she matched the description, and Maya replied that was impossible because she had been at the academy all day, and told them to check her implant logs. Bennett said implants can be hacked, and moved closer with his intentions written in every aggressive gesture, and he said they needed to search her and told her to come with them. And Maya's neural implant screamed warnings as the officers surrounded her, and her emergency beacon activated automatically, sending distress signals across every frequency. But they had planned for that, and Bennett pulled out a signal jammer, and Maya felt her connection to the network die. She said they were making a mistake while backing toward the platform stairs, and started to say her father would help. But Sullivan interrupted with a laugh being a harsh sound, and he asked if her father was another alien lover. Or maybe he was off-world serving with those traitors who think mixing with the Xenos makes them stronger. And the words hit Maya like physical blows. And her father, Colonel Marcus Carter, commanded the Terran Defense Fleet's 7th Strike Division, being humanity's elite force that protected Earth's interests across 3 star systems. He had fought in the Battle of Proxima and saved countless lives during the Yas-Kryn incursion, and earned decorations from 5 different species, and these men dared to call him a traitor. And before she could respond, they grabbed her, and Maya fought with her academy combat training kicking in. But 3 grown men overpowered her within seconds, and they dragged her up the platform stairs with her feet scraping against the metal grating. Morris said the train would be there in 9 minutes while checking his display, and he suggested teaching this little academic a lesson about respecting authority. And they bound her hands with neural suppression cuffs, being the kind used for violent criminals, and tied her to the platform's central support beam, and the metal pressed cold against her back, and below the magnetic tracks hummed with building energy as they prepared for the incoming train. Maya said please with her composure finally cracking, and told them they didn't have to do this. And Bennett said oh, but they did, while kneeling to check her bonds, and he said she and her kind thought they were better than them, being smart enough to consort with aliens and give them human technology and culture. And someone needed to remind her what happens to traitors. And Sullivan laughed again, saying when that train comes through, they would find her eventually and probably rule it an accident, being a stupid kid playing around on the platform. And he said tragic. Really, Maya's wrist display showed 6:54 p.m., meaning 6 minutes remained, and 400 kilometers above Earth's surface aboard the orbital command station, Sentinel Prime. Colonel Marcus Carter felt the emergency beacon die, being his daughter's beacon, and Marcus stood 2 meters tall, with his dark skin bearing the faint scars of A dozen battles and his military uniform crisp despite the late hour, and he had been reviewing deployment schedules when the initial distress signal pierced through his consciousness. His own military-grade neural implant had instantly locked onto Maya's position, tracking her vitals and her location and her desperate attempt to call for help. But then nothing came through, being complete silence, and someone had jammed her signal, and Lieutenant Sarah Price, being his second in command, noticed his sudden stillness and asked what was wrong. And Marcus said his daughter was in trouble, with his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the command center look up, and he said he needed emergency transport to New Atlanta immediately. Price started to say that would require certain procedures, but Marcus interrupted, saying he didn't care about regulations. And the words came out as a roar, and Marcus forced himself to breathe and think tactically, even as terror clawed at his chest. And he explained someone deliberately blocked her emergency signal, meaning law enforcement couldn't respond, and that meant she was in immediate danger. And he pulled up his command interface with fingers flying across holographic displays. The last known position of Maya's beacon appeared overlaid with real-time traffic data, and his blood ran cold, seeing the West Side platform with train arrival in 5 minutes, and Marcus commanded emergency shuttle to his coordinates and told them to override all flight restrictions, with authorization being Carter Delta 793, and Price was already on it, saying shuttle prepped and ready, with flight time to New Atlanta being 3 minutes and 20 seconds. But that was too long because the train would arrive first. Marcus ran with his enhanced military physiology, pushing him faster than any civilian could move, and the shuttle's engines were already screaming to life as he vaulted into the pilot's seat, and he barked orders saying, "Someone get him a link to New Atlanta Transit Authority, and to contact Major Lisa Hamilton at City Police Headquarters, and tell her he needed immediate backup at West Side platform." And the shuttle screamed through the sky, breaking every speed limit and every safety protocol. But Marcus didn't care. In his mind's eye, he saw Maya as a little girl holding his hand as they walked through the park, and he saw her first day at the academy with her eyes shining with pride, and he saw every moment of her life flashing before him, and he saw what he would do to anyone who hurt her. And back on the platform, Maya watched the 3 officers retreat to the far end with their faces twisted with anticipation, and the magnetic tracks below began their warning sequence with lights pulsing in preparation for the incoming train. 3 minutes remained, and she pulled at the neural suppression cuffs, feeling them bite into her wrists, and the restraints were designed to prevent any kind of electronic manipulation or any attempt to hack her way free. And even her enhanced implant, gifted to her by her father after she had graduated top of her class, couldn't break through their encryption, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the ozone smell of the magnetic repulsion fields, and far down the track, maybe 5 kilometers away, she could see the train's forward lights beginning to appear like a bright star, growing steadily larger. Morris called out, saying her father was probably off-world right now, with his voice carrying over the wind, and he said something about sucking up to tentacled freaks and learning to bow and scrape to their supposed allies, and asked what would he think if he could see her now. And Maya closed her eyes, trying to control her breathing, and fear threatened to overwhelm her. But she forced it down because she was Marcus Carter's daughter, and she didn't break, and she didn't surrender. She thought there had to be a way out, and considered the platform's emergency systems, thinking if she could just reach the manual override panel, maybe she could trigger a security alert. But the panel was 3 meters away, being completely out of reach, and 2 minutes remained, and the train's lights grew brighter, and Maya could hear its magnetic engines now being a deep thrumming that vibrated through the platform's metal structure. And these trains traveled at 300 kilometers per hour through the city's elevated track system. And at that speed, the emergency braking sequence would take at least a full kilometer to stop, and she realized she was going to die here, murdered by men who were supposed to protect citizens, and killed for the color of her skin and her father's service to humanity. But she refused to accept it, and Maya opened her eyes and looked directly at Morris. The military shuttle hit the platform's airspace, moving at twice the speed of civilian traffic, with its emergency override screaming through every comm channel, and Marcus didn't bother with a landing approach, and he simply killed the engines and let the craft drop, using the repulsion fields to brake at the last possible second. and the shuttle slammed onto the platform with a shriek of stressed metal, landing 50 meters from where Maya was bound, and Marcus was out before the engines, finished powering down with his military augmentations, flooding his system with combat stimulants. The world slowed to a crawl as his neural implant shifted into tactical mode, overlaying threat assessments and target acquisition data across his vision. And he saw 3 hostile targets, all armed and all moving toward his daughter, who was bound to the central support beam, like some kind of sacrifice, and the train was now 1 minute out, and Marcus said, "Step away from her," with his voice, carrying the weight of 1,000 battles and the authority of a man who had commanded fleets in the void between stars, and he told them to step away right now, or he would end them. Morris spun around with his plasma stunner coming up and shouted, "This is official police business," and told Marcus to stand down. And Marcus asked official business while moving forward with each step, precise and calculated. And he said they had bound a 16-year-old girl to a train platform with a maglev, arriving in 53 seconds, and they had jammed her emergency beacon. And he told them they weren't police but murderers. And Bennett and Sullivan flanked Morris with their weapons. Also drawn, Bennett said they knew who Marcus was and that he was one of them, being an alien sympathizer and a traitor. And Marcus's expression didn't change, and he said last chance, telling them to drop their weapons and step away from his daughter, and Morris laughed, asking, "Or what?" Because Marcus was one man and they were 3 armed officers, and told him to do the math. And Marcus said he had done the math, explaining 47 seconds until the train arrives, and 2.3 seconds for him to neutralize all 3 of them, and 38 seconds to free Maya and get her to safety, with 7 seconds of margin for error. He smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression any of them had ever seen, and he said, "Now let me show you what humanity's best can do." And Morris fired first. But Marcus had already moved, and the plasma bolt passed through empty air where Marcus had been standing a microsecond before. And he had fought against the Kryn Hive warriors, being beings whose reflexes operated at near light speed, and he had dueled with Vexnar honor guards trained from birth in combat, and these 3 corrupt cops moved like statues in comparison. Marcus crossed the distance to Morris in 3 augmented strides, with his hand snapping out to catch the officer's wrist. Mid-swing and bone cracked, and the plasma stunner clattered to the ground, and Sullivan tried to line up a shot. But Marcus spun Morris around like a shield, then released him with a calculated push that sent him crashing into Sullivan. And both men went down in a tangle of limbs, and Bennett was smarter, having moved to get a clear angle with his finger already tightening on the trigger. Marcus drew his service weapon, being a military-grade plasma pistol that made the police stunners look like children's toys, and fired in the same motion. And the bolt caught Bennett's weapon, superheating the metal and causing him to drop it with a scream. And 2.1 seconds had passed, being close enough, and Marcus was already moving toward Maya with his weapon, tracking the 3 downed officers, and he commanded them to stay down, saying if any of them so much as twitched, he would consider it a hostile action. And right now, he was looking for an excuse. He reached Maya and 4 more strides with his free hand, already pulling a neural override key from his belt, and the same key that had once opened Kryn prison cells could handle simple police restraints. And Maya whispered, "Dad," and Marcus heard the fear in her voice, and the trauma and the relief, and he said softly, "I'm here, baby girl," even as his neural implant screamed warnings about the approaching train with 29 seconds remaining, and he told her he was there. The neural suppression cuffs clicked open, and Maya fell forward, and Marcus caught her with one arm supporting her, while his other hand kept his weapon trained on the 3 officers. And she gasped about the train, and Marcus said he knew, and his implant was already broadcasting on emergency frequencies, sending override commands to the approaching train. But he told her they weren't done here, and he turned to face Morris and Bennett and Sullivan, who were slowly picking themselves up off the platform. The train's lights now illuminated the entire station with its magnetic field, creating a pressure wave that made the air itself vibrate, and 15 seconds remained. And Marcus said, "Do you want to know what makes humanity special?" with his voice cutting through the roar of the approaching train, and he explained it wasn't their technology and it wasn't their military might, because the Kryn had better weapons, and the Vexnar had stronger warriors, and the Astral Collective had ships that could traverse galaxies. 10 seconds remained, and Marcus continued saying, "What makes us special is our choice." And he explained when they faced the Kryn, they chose to fight, and when the Vexnar offered alliance, they chose to accept, and when other species looked at them and saw primitives, They chose to prove them wrong, and 5 seconds remained, and Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried over the train's roar, saying, "And when ignorant, hateful cowards like you tried to drag us back into the darkness, we chose to be better." The train erupted onto the platform with its emergency brakes screaming and magnetic fields flaring with enough force to rattle teeth, and it slowed and stopped just meters from where they all stood. And Marcus's override had worked, and Maya was safe, and Major Lisa Hamilton arrived 3 minutes later with a full tactical squad, and she took one look at the scene, seeing Marcus Carter holding his daughter, while 3 officers sat restrained with their own cuffs, and her expression turned to stone. She said formally Colonel Carter and asked if he could brief her on the situation. And Marcus did, with his voice clinical despite the rage still burning in his chest. And he referenced Maya's emergency beacon and the signal jamming, and the restraints and the timing of the train, and he outlined exactly what these 3 men had intended to do. And Hamilton listened with her face growing darker with each detail. And when Marcus finished, she turned to her officers. She ordered them to take the 3 men into custody with maximum security holding, and listed charges being attempted: murder and abuse of authority and terrorism, and about a dozen others, she would add, once she had reviewed the full evidence. And Morris shouted, "This is insane," as officers hauled him to his feet, saying they were cops and they were just trying to do their job. But Hamilton cut him off, saying they were just about to murder a teenage girl, and they did it wearing badges, and told them they disgraced every officer who actually tries to serve this city, as they dragged the 3 men away. Bennett twisted around to glare at Marcus, saying, "This isn't over," and people like them were everywhere, and they weren't going to let Marcus and his alien-loving kind ruin humanity. And Marcus met his gaze steadily, saying Bennett was wrong about one thing, and this was over for him at least, and humanity had moved on. And they had evolved past the hatred that defined Bennett and his kind, and Marcus told him they were relics, being echoes of a darker time, and history was leaving them behind. The words seemed to hit Bennett harder than any physical blow, and he slumped suddenly, looking older and defeated. And after they were gone, Hamilton approached Marcus and Maya, saying she was sorry, quietly, and she explained she had been trying to root out the extremists in the department, but they were well hidden, and tonight they revealed themselves at least. And Maya said it wasn't Hamilton's fault while speaking for the first time since her father's arrival, and she explained they were scared of change and of the future, and of losing the world. They thought they understood. Hamilton looked at her with respect, saying that was remarkably compassionate considering what they tried to do to her. And Maya glanced at her father, explaining she learned from the best, and her dad taught her that being strong doesn't mean being cruel, and that understanding your enemy doesn't mean forgiving them, and that the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons but with the choice to be better than those who hate you. And Marcus felt pride swell in his chest, thinking this was his daughter and this was humanity's future. The trial would come later, and the sentences would be harsh, and the story would spread across the galaxy. But right now, in this moment, Marcus held his daughter close and felt grateful she was alive, and Maya leaned against him, feeling safe for the first time since the ordeal began, and the city lights sparkled below them, and somewhere above the stars waited with infinite patience for humanity to continue its journey outward into the cosmos. The trial of officers Morris and Bennett and Sullivan lasted 3 weeks, and the evidence was overwhelming, including neural logs and security footage and witness statements from the train operator who had seen Maya bound to the platform, and the jury deliberated for 47 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, and the sentences were harsh, being 25 years in a maximum security facility with additional penalties for hate crimes, and they would serve every day of it. But the real story wasn't about 3 corrupt cops, and it was about what happened next, and Maya's testimony, being her calm recounting of the attack and her father's rescue, went viral across the human networks and beyond. And within hours, billions of beings across dozens of worlds had seen footage of the incident and heard her words about choosing to be better, and the galactic response was immediate and overwhelming. The Vexnar Council issued a formal commendation for Marcus's actions, and the Astral Collective offered Maya a full scholarship to their most prestigious academy. And even the Kryn, being humanity's former enemies, sent a message praising the display of what they called tactical precision, combined with moral clarity. And news channels across Earth replayed the security footage showing the moment Marcus arrived on the platform, and the way he had dismantled 3 armed men in seconds, While protecting his daughter, human rights organizations called for comprehensive reform of law enforcement, and politicians rushed to condemn the attack and promise stronger oversight, and alien ambassadors sent messages of support to Maya and her family, and the incident sparked conversations across the galaxy about prejudice and fear, and the difficult path toward true integration. And for Marcus and Maya, the most important moment came 3 days after the incident. As they sat together in their apartment overlooking New Atlanta's gleaming skyline, Maya admitted she was so scared, being the first time she had really acknowledged it, and she said she thought she was going to die. And Marcus pulled her close, saying he knew, and he was sorry she had to experience that, but he wanted her to understand something. And what happened to her wasn't her fault, and it wasn't because of anything she did or didn't do, and it was because of their fear, and their hate, and their inability to accept the future. Maya said she knew, but it still hurt, and knowing that there were humans out there who would rather kill other humans than accept that they were all in this together caused pain. And Marcus agreed, saying, "It does hurt, and it hurt him too." And every day he saw the best of humanity being brave men and women who served alongside alien allies and who risked their lives to protect species they barely understood. And then he saw people like Morris and his friends, and he wondered how they could be the same species. He paused, looking out at the city where human and alien vessels crisscrossed the sky in perfect harmony. And he said, "But then I look at you, and I see your intelligence, and your compassion, and your refusal to let hate define you. And I realize that this is what humanity is really about, and not the people who cling to the past, but the ones like you who embrace the future." And Maya wiped her eyes, asking, "What if more people like them were out there? And what if this happened again?" Marcus said firmly, "Then we will deal with it together, because that's what humanity does, and we adapt and we overcome, and we choose to be better than the worst versions of ourselves." And he stood and walked to the window, gesturing at the sprawling metropolis, and said, "Look out there, because 200 years ago, this city was torn apart by prejudice and violence, and people couldn't imagine a world where skin color didn't determine your worth. And now we live in a world where species doesn't determine your worth." Maya said, "We've come so far," while joining him at the window, and Marcus promised they would go further, because every generation of humans has faced those who said they couldn't change, and who insisted they were trapped by their worst impulses, and every generation has proven them wrong, and below them the city pulsed with life, and human children played alongside young Vexnar in the parks, and Kryn merchants traded stories with Terran shopkeepers, and astral scholars debated philosophy with human students in open-air cafes. This was humanity's legacy, and not the hatred of a few, but the hope of many, and not the violence of the past, but the unity of the future. And Maya leaned against her father, feeling his steady strength and his unshakable conviction that humanity could be better and would be better, and she whispered, "Humanity? Fuck yeah," using the old phrase that had become humanity's rallying cry among the stars. And Marcus smiled, agreeing, "Humanity, fuck yeah." And as the twin suns of Earth's binary star system set over New Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, father and daughter stood together, being two members of a species that had reached for the stars and refused to let go, no matter how hard the journey became, and they were humanity's best, and they would never stop fighting for humanity's future. In the weeks that followed, Maya returned to her academy studies with renewed determination, and her classmates, both human and alien, welcomed her back with support and admiration. And she found herself becoming something of a symbol, being a young person who had faced hatred and survived, and who chose to respond with wisdom rather than anger. And her teachers noticed a new depth to her work and a maturity that came from understanding the stakes of the world they were building. Marcus continued his duties with the Terran Defense Fleet, but he made sure to spend more time on Earth with his daughter, and the incident had reminded him that protecting humanity meant more than just defending against external threats, and it meant standing up against the darkness within their own species and helping to guide the next generation toward a better future. And his fellow officers treated him with even greater respect, knowing he had faced an impossible situation and handled it with both strength and restraint. Major Hamilton led a comprehensive investigation into the police department, uncovering a network of extremists who had been operating in secret for years, and dozens of officers were dismissed and others faced criminal charges. and the department began implementing new protocols and training programs focused on tolerance and cooperation with alien species. And Hamilton herself became a champion for reform, speaking at conferences across the galaxy about the importance of accountability and law enforcement. The Vexnar ambassador visited Maya personally, bringing gifts from their homeworld and speaking about how their own species had faced similar struggles centuries ago when they first encountered other civilizations, and the ambassador told Maya that every species goes through growing pains as they learn to see beyond their own kind, and that what matters is how they respond when faced with their own ugliness. And Maya listened carefully, understanding that the struggle she had experienced was part of something larger and more universal. One evening, Maya sat in her room working on a paper about quantum entanglement when she received a message from an unexpected source, and it was from a young human woman named Rachel, who lived in another city, and Rachel explained that she had been following Maya's story and wanted to share her own experience of facing prejudice, and they began corresponding regularly, finding comfort in knowing they weren't alone. And soon other young people joined their conversations, creating a network of support for those who believed in humanity's better nature. Marcus watched his daughter grow and change in the aftermath of the attack, and he saw her become more confident and more outspoken, and more determined to make a difference in the world. And one night as they ate dinner together, she told him about an idea she had, and she wanted to create an organization that would connect young humans with alien youth to foster understanding and break down the barriers of fear and prejudice. And Marcus listened with pride swelling in his chest. He told her it was an excellent idea and offered to help her get started using his connections in the military and diplomatic corps. And within months, Maya's organization had chapters in 20 cities across Earth and was expanding to human colonies on other worlds, and young people of all species came together to learn about each other's cultures and work on joint projects and challenge the old assumptions that had kept their species apart for so long. The incident on the platform became a turning point not just for Maya and Marcus, but for New Atlanta and for Earth as a whole, and it forced humanity to confront the reality that integration with the galactic community required more than just technology and trade, and it required a fundamental shift in how they saw themselves and their place in the universe, and it required the courage to stand against those who would drag them back into isolation and fear. And though there would be more challenges ahead and more battles to fight against ignorance and hatred, the story of Maya Carter and her father Marcus became a reminder of what humanity could be at its best, and it showed that even in the darkest moments when fear and prejudice threatened to overwhelm them, there were those who would stand firm and choose a better path, and that choice made all the difference. 6 months after the platform incident, Maya stood before an auditorium filled with students from 12 different species, and she was giving a presentation about her organization and how it worked to build bridges between different worlds and cultures. And as she spoke about cooperation and understanding, she felt a sense of purpose that had been born from that terrible night when she faced death and emerged stronger. In the audience sat not just human students but young Vexnar with their distinctive silver skin and crystalline eyes, and Kryn youth whose chitinous bodies gleamed under the lights, and astral beings who shimmered with an inner light, and representatives from species Maya had never even heard of before joining Earth's community. And they all listened intently as she described her vision for a future where fear and prejudice would have no place. Marcus watched from the back of the auditorium with pride radiating from every part of his being, and beside him stood Major Hamilton, who had become a close friend to their family in the months since the attack, and she leaned over and whispered that Maya was extraordinary, and Marcus agreed, saying she gets it from her mother, and Hamilton smiled, knowing that Maya's mother had died years ago defending a colony from raiders, and that her legacy lived on in their daughter. After the presentation ended, students crowded around Maya asking questions and sharing their own stories, and a young Vexnar named Kira spoke about facing discrimination on her homeworld for wanting to study human culture, and a Kryn student named Zax described how his family had been ostracized for supporting the alliance with Earth, and Maya listened to each story with compassion, understanding that the struggle against prejudice was universal. That evening, as Maya and Marcus walked home through the busy streets of New Atlanta, they talked about the future, and Marcus asked if she had given any thought to what she wanted to do after graduating from the academy, And Maya said she had been thinking about it a lot, and she wanted to continue building bridges between species, maybe through diplomatic work or education, and she wanted to honor what had happened to her by making sure it led to something positive. Marcus told her that whatever path she chose, he would support her completely, and he reminded her that she had already accomplished more than many people did in a lifetime, and she had taken a moment of darkness and turned it into a beacon of hope. And Maya squeezed his hand, saying she couldn't have done it without him, and without his example of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The next week brought unexpected news when Maya received an invitation to speak at the Galactic Council on Earth's orbital station, and the council wanted to hear directly from young people about their experiences with integration, and Maya would be one of 5 speakers representing humanity, and she felt both honored and nervous about addressing such an important gathering. Marcus helped her prepare for the speech, working with her late into the night to refine her message and make sure she expressed herself clearly, and he shared stories from his own diplomatic experiences about how to address a diverse audience and how to find common ground, even when cultures seemed vastly different, and Maya absorbed every lesson, grateful for his guidance. The day of the council meeting arrived, and Maya stood in the observation deck of the shuttle, taking them up to the orbital station. And she watched Earth grow smaller below them, with its blue oceans and green continents, and the white swirls of clouds. And she thought about how small their planet was in the vastness of space, and yet how important it was as a home to billions of people and countless other beings. The Galactic Council chamber was enormous, with seating for representatives from over 200 species, and the architecture blended styles from dozens of different civilizations, creating a space that belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. And Maya felt intimidated at first, but then she remembered why she was there and what she wanted to say, and her nervousness transformed into determination. When her turn came to speak, Maya walked to the podium and looked out at the assembled delegates, and she began by thanking them for the opportunity to address the council, and then she told her story, starting with that night on the platform and the 3 officers who tried to kill her, and the fear she felt, and her father's dramatic rescue, and the choice she made afterward to respond with hope rather than anger. She spoke about how easy it would have been to let that experience fill her with bitterness and to see all law enforcement as enemies, and to retreat into suspicion and fear. But instead she chose to believe in the possibility of change and in the fundamental goodness that existed in most people regardless of their species, and she talked about her organization and the friendships she had formed with beings from other worlds. Maya explained that every species faced the same challenge when encountering others, who were different, and the challenge was to see past surface differences and recognize the common threads of hopes and dreams and fears that united all intelligent life. And she said that prejudice thrived in ignorance but withered in the light of understanding, and that was why programs like hers were so important. She concluded by saying that the future of the galaxy depended on young people like her and like the students in her organization who refused to accept that hate was inevitable and who believed that different species could not only coexist but thrive together. And she challenged the council to invest more resources in education and cultural exchange programs and to support those working to build bridges rather than walls. When Maya finished speaking, there was a moment of silence, and then the chamber erupted in applause, and delegates from species she had never met rose to their feet, and Marcus, watching from the visitors' gallery, felt tears streaming down his face, and he knew that his daughter had found her calling, and that she would change the galaxy in ways he could barely imagine. After the session ended, several council members approached Maya to congratulate her and discuss her ideas, and an elderly astral delegate named Thorn, who had served on the council for over a century, told her that she reminded him of the visionaries who had first proposed the Galactic Alliance, and that her generation would build on the foundation they had laid and create something even greater. A Vexnar ambassador offered to help expand Maya's organization to the Vexnar homeworld, and several other delegates pledged funding and resources, and Maya realized that her speech had touched something deep in the assembled representatives, and that they were hungry for the kind of hope and optimism she represented, and she felt overwhelmed by the responsibility, but also energized by the possibilities. That night Marcus took Maya to dinner at a restaurant on the Orbital station that specialized in fusion cuisine combining recipes from multiple worlds, and as they ate and talked about the day's events, Marcus told her how proud he was, and how her mother would have been proud too. And Maya smiled, saying she hoped she was living up to both their legacies. Marcus said she was doing more than that, and she was creating her own legacy and showing the galaxy what humanity was capable of when it chose courage over fear and compassion over hatred. And he raised his glass in a toast, saying, "To the future and to the bridges we build," and Maya clinked her glass against his, repeating, "To the bridges we build." As they looked out the restaurant's viewport at the stars stretching to infinity, and at Earth spinning peacefully below them, father and daughter both felt a sense of hope that had been hard-earned through pain and struggle. And they knew that the road ahead would not be easy, and that there would be more people like Morris and Bennett and Sullivan who would try to tear down what they were building. But they also knew that they were not alone, and that across the galaxy, millions of beings were working toward the same goal of a future where differences were celebrated rather than feared, and where cooperation replaced conflict. And in that moment, surrounded by the infinite possibilities of space, they felt certain that humanity's greatest adventures were still ahead. A year passed since the platform incident, and Maya's 17th birthday arrived with celebrations that brought together friends from across the solar system, and her apartment was filled with humans, and Vexnar and Kryn and astral beings all gathered to honor the young woman who had become a symbol of hope and unity. And Marcus watched from the kitchen as Maya laughed and talked with her friends, feeling grateful that she had found joy again after such trauma. Kira, the young Vexnar, who had first approached Maya after her presentation, had become one of her closest friends, and they spent hours discussing philosophy and mathematics and the similarities between their cultures. And Kira often said that meeting Maya had changed her life and given her courage to pursue her dreams despite the opposition she faced on her homeworld. Zax, the Kryn student, was also there, and he had become the coordinator for Maya's organization on his homeworld, and he told stories about how young Kryn were eager to learn about other species and break free from the isolation that had defined their culture for generations. And he credited Maya with inspiring an entire movement among Kryn youth. Rachel, the human woman who had first reached out to Maya after hearing her story, had moved to New Atlanta to work with the organization full-time, and she and Maya had become inseparable friends, and together they planned events and coordinated with chapters across dozens of worlds, and built a network that was changing how young people thought about integration and cooperation. As the party continued into the evening, Marcus pulled Maya aside for a private moment, and he handed her a small box and told her it had belonged to her mother, and he had been saving it for this day. And Maya opened it to find a pendant showing Earth and the stars around it, and her mother had worn it during her service as a colony defender. Marcus explained that her mother had believed deeply in humanity's potential to be a force for good in the galaxy, and she had died defending that belief, and he wanted Maya to have the pendant as a reminder that she was carrying on her mother's legacy and making the galaxy a better place. And Maya hugged him tightly with tears in her eyes and thanked him for everything he had done for her. Later that week, Maya received news that would change her life again, and the Galactic Council had voted to create a new position called the Youth Integration Ambassador. And they wanted Maya to be the first person to hold the role, and she would travel to different worlds and speak about integration and help establish programs similar to her organization and coordinate youth initiatives across the galaxy. Marcus was thrilled when Maya told him about the offer, but he also felt a pang of sadness knowing it would mean she would spend less time on Earth and more time traveling through space. And Maya saw the conflict in his expression and asked if he thought she should accept, and Marcus said without hesitation that she absolutely should, because this was her destiny and she had to follow it. He reminded her that he traveled constantly for his military duties, and yet they always found time to stay connected, and this would be no different. And besides, he said with a smile, he could request assignments that would bring him near wherever she was stationed. And Maya laughed, saying she would like that very much, and she accepted the position. The next day, the first few months in her new role were overwhelming as Maya traveled to the Vexnar homeworld and then to the astral systems and met with government leaders and educators and youth groups, and everywhere she went, she found the same hunger for connection and the same desire to overcome the barriers that kept species apart. and she discovered that her story resonated across cultural boundaries on the Vexnar homeworld. Maya witnessed protests by conservative groups who opposed integration with other species, and she saw how Kira and other young Vexnar faced harassment and threats for their beliefs, and it reminded her painfully of that night on the platform, and she understood that the fight against prejudice was far from over and would require constant vigilance. But she also saw hope in the thousands of young Vexnar who attended her speeches and joined her programs, and who were determined to build a different future for their world. And one evening after a particularly successful event, Kira told Maya that she had given their generation permission to dream, and that was the greatest gift anyone could offer. The astral systems presented different challenges as their culture was so different from human, experienced that finding common ground required patience and creativity, and Maya spent weeks learning about astral philosophy and communication styles, and slowly building relationships with astral youth, who were curious about other species but unsure how to connect. She organized joint art projects that allowed astral and human students to express themselves through their respective mediums, and she found that creativity was a universal language that transcended species barriers, and the friendships that formed through these projects became the foundation for deeper cultural exchange. Marcus kept his promise to stay connected, and he managed to arrange his schedule so that he visited Maya every few weeks, and they would have dinner together and talk about their respective work, and he marveled at how much she had grown and how confident she had become. And Maya told him that she drew strength from knowing he was out there protecting the systems she was working to unite. One day Marcus arrived on the station where Maya was based with news that made him visibly uncomfortable, and military intelligence had uncovered evidence of a growing extremist network that spanned multiple human colonies, and they were planning coordinated attacks against alien populations, and Marcus's fleet had been tasked with stopping them. Maya felt her blood run cold, remembering Morris and Bennett and Sullivan, and realizing that the hatred they represented hadn't died with their imprisonment. And Marcus saw her fear and took her hand, saying this was exactly why her work was so important, and every young person she reached was one less potential recruit for the extremists, and every bridge she built made their message of division weaker. She asked if he would be in danger, and Marcus admitted that stopping the extremists would be risky, but that it was necessary, and he reminded her that she faced her own dangers every time she spoke out against prejudice, and that they were both fighting the same war on different fronts. And Maya nodded, understanding that this was the reality of the world they had chosen to help create. Before Marcus left, Maya gave him the pendant her mother had worn and asked him to carry it with him for luck, and Marcus protested, saying it was hers now, but Maya insisted, explaining that she wanted him to have a piece of both her and her mother with him, and he finally agreed and fastened it around his neck and promised to return it when his mission was complete. The weeks that followed were tense as Maya continued her work but worried constantly about her father, and she threw herself into her duties, organizing a major conference that would bring together youth leaders from 50 different worlds, and she hoped that by staying busy, she could keep the fear at bay and trust that Marcus would come through as he always did. News of skirmishes reached her through official channels, but details were scarce due to operational security, and Maya found herself checking her messages obsessively, hoping for word from Marcus and her friends, noticed her distraction, and rallied around her, offering support, and reminding her that Marcus was one of the best military commanders in the fleet, and would surely succeed. Then one morning Maya woke to find an urgent message waiting, and her heart pounded as she opened it, fearing the worst, but it was from Marcus saying the operation was complete, and the extremist network had been dismantled, and he was safe and would see her soon. And Maya collapsed in relief and cried tears of gratitude, and then immediately began planning a celebration. When Marcus finally returned to the station where Maya was working, she ran into his arms and held him tight and refused to let go for several minutes, and he laughed and said he had told her he would be fine, but she shook her head, saying she would always worry because that's what families did, and Marcus couldn't argue with that logic, and he returned the pendant to her, saying it had brought him luck. Just as she promised over dinner, Marcus told her about the operation and how they had discovered that the extremist network was larger than anyone had suspected, with cells operating on 17 different colonies, and some members had even infiltrated military installations and government offices, and the conspiracy went deeper than just a few hateful individuals. and it represented a coordinated effort to undermine galactic integration. Maya listened with growing concern, realizing that the threat to the future she was trying to build was more serious than she had understood, and Marcus explained that they had arrested over 200 conspirators and seized weapons and explosives and prevented attacks that would have killed thousands of innocent beings, and the operation had been a success. But it was clear that more vigilance would be needed going forward. He told her that during the raids they had found propaganda materials that specifically targeted young people and tried to recruit them to the extremist cause, and the materials portrayed integration as a threat to human identity and painted aliens as enemies who would destroy humanity. And Marcus said that seeing these materials made him understand even more deeply why Maya's work was so crucial. Maya asked how they could combat such organized hatred, and Marcus said the answer was exactly what she was already doing, and by building genuine relationships between species and showing young people the benefits of cooperation, they could create immunity against extremist propaganda, and education and experience were the best weapons against fear and ignorance. The major conference that Maya had been organizing arrived 2 weeks later, and young leaders from 50 worlds gathered on a neutral station to discuss integration challenges and share successful strategies, and the energy in the conference hall was electric, as beings who had only communicated remotely finally met face-to-face and formed connections that would shape the future of galactic relations. Maya gave the opening address, and she spoke about her journey from that terrifying night on the platform to this moment standing before representatives of so many worlds, and she told them that fear and hatred were easy, but building bridges required courage and persistence, and the willingness to be vulnerable. And she challenged everyone present to commit to being bridge builders in their own communities. The workshops and discussions that followed were intense and productive, and participants shared stories of facing prejudice and overcoming cultural barriers and developing programs that brought different species together. And Maya moved from group to group, listening and learning and feeling inspired by the creativity and dedication she witnessed. One particularly moving moment came when a young human named Danny from a remote colony stood up and described how he had once believed the extremist propaganda and had been recruited to their cause. But then he met a Kryn engineer who saved his life during a station malfunction, and that act of kindness from someone he had been taught to hate changed everything. And now he dedicated himself to fighting against the prejudice he had once embraced. Danny's story reminded everyone that people could change, and that even those who had fallen into hatred could find their way back with the right experiences and support. And Maya made sure to spend time with Danny afterward, and she encouraged him to share his story more widely, because it demonstrated that redemption was possible, and that gave hope to everyone working to change hearts and minds. During a break in the conference, Maya found herself in conversation with an elderly Kryn named Elder Thax, who had been one of the architects of the Yao, original alliance between the Kryn and humanity, and he told her that in his long life he had seen many attempts at building cooperation between species, and most had failed because they focused on governments and treaties, rather than on people and relationships. He said that Maya's approach of focusing on youth and grassroots connections was the right strategy, and it would create lasting change in ways that political agreements never could. And he predicted that the network she was building would become the foundation for a truly integrated galactic civilization, and she should never doubt the importance of her work, even when progress seemed slow. Elder Thax also warned her that there would always be those who opposed integration and who would try to tear down what she built. And he told her to stay strong and remember that every generation had to fight for the future they wanted, and complacency was the enemy of progress. And Maya thanked him for his wisdom and promised to carry his words with her. The conference concluded with a joint declaration signed by all participants committing to specific goals for increasing integration and cultural exchange over the next year. And Maya felt a sense of accomplishment looking at the signatures representing so many different worlds and cultures, and knowing that these young leaders would return home and multiply the impact of what they had learned. Marcus attended the closing ceremony and watched with pride as Maya accepted thanks from the conference organizers and delegates, and afterward he told her that her mother would have been incredibly proud. And Maya said she hoped so, and that she tried every day to live up to the example both her parents had set. And Marcus pulled her close, saying she was already exceeding any expectations they could have had. In the weeks following the conference, Maya noticed a shift in how people responded to her work, and the conference had generated significant media attention across the galaxy. And her message was reaching broader audiences, and she began receiving invitations to speak at universities and governmental bodies, and her influence was growing beyond just youth organizations. One invitation particularly excited her, and it came from the Kryn High Council, asking her to address them about human-Kryn relations, and no human had ever been invited to speak directly to the council, and Maya saw it as an opportunity to strengthen the alliance and demonstrate that young voices deserve to be heard on matters of galactic importance. She spent weeks preparing for the address, studying Kryn history and culture, and consulting with Zax and other Kryn friends about how to present her ideas in ways that would resonate with the council, and she knew this was a chance to make a real difference in how the Kryn viewed integration, and she didn't want to waste it. Marcus helped her practice her speech and offered advice based on his own experiences dealing with Kryn military leaders, and he reminded her to be respectful of their traditions, while also being honest about the challenges and opportunities that integration presented, and he told her to speak from her heart, because authenticity was what made her message so powerful. The day before Maya was scheduled to leave for the Kryn homeworld, she received disturbing news, and intelligence reports indicated that an extremist group was planning to disrupt her speech and possibly attempt an attack, and security forces were taking the threat seriously and recommended postponing the trip. But Maya refused, saying that giving in to fear was exactly what the extremists wanted. Marcus understood her reasoning, but insisted on accompanying her with a full security detail, and Maya agreed, knowing that her father would never let her face danger alone, and she appreciated his protectiveness, even as she chafed against the restrictions it placed on her freedom. And they both knew that the stakes were too high to take unnecessary risks as they prepared to depart. Marcus had a serious conversation with Maya about the reality they faced, and he explained that the more successful she became at building bridges, the more she would become a target for those who opposed integration, and she needed to be prepared for ongoing threats and challenges and accept that her work came with real dangers. Maya told her father that she understood the risks, but she wouldn't let fear dictate her choices, and she had faced death once before on that platform and survived, and now she had work to do that was bigger than her own safety. And Marcus nodded, with respect in his eyes, saying that was exactly the response he expected from his daughter, and together they would face whatever challenges came. The journey to the Kryn homeworld took 3 days, and during that time Maya reviewed her speech constantly and made final adjustments and talked with the security team about protocols and contingency plans, and she tried not to think about the possibility of an attack, but the threat hung over everything like a dark cloud, and she found it hard to sleep. Marcus sensed her anxiety and spent time with her discussing everything except the upcoming speech, and they talked about memories of her childhood and stories about her mother and plans for the future. And gradually Maya relaxed and remembered that no matter what happened, she had people who loved her and supported her, and that gave her strength. When they arrived at the Kryn homeworld, Maya was struck by its beauty, and the planet was covered in crystalline structures that caught the light of their twin suns and created rainbows that danced across the landscape. And the Kryn had built their cities in harmony with these natural formations, creating a blend of nature and architecture unlike anything Maya had ever seen. Zax met them at the landing platform, with a delegation of young Kryn who had traveled from across the planet to show their support, and they presented Maya with traditional gifts and spoke about how much her work meant to them and how it had given them courage to push for change in their own society. And Maya felt humbled by their words and more determined than ever to deliver a speech worthy of their faith. The Kryn High Council chamber was an ancient structure carved from a single massive crystal, and it amplified sound in ways that made every word resonate with power. And Maya stood at the center, looking up at the council members seated in tiers above her, and she took a deep breath and began to speak. She started by thanking the council for the invitation and acknowledging the historic nature of the moment. And then she told them about her experience on the platform, and how it had taught her that fear and hatred were choices, and that courage was also a choice. And she explained that the Kryn and humanity faced similar challenges as they learned to trust species that had once been enemies. Maya spoke about the young Kryn she had met, who were eager to learn about other cultures and build friendships across species boundaries, and she argued that these young people represented the future, and that the Council had a responsibility to support them and create opportunities for integration rather than clinging to old suspicions and isolation. She acknowledged that change was difficult and that it required taking risks and trusting others who might seem strange or threatening. But she pointed out that the Kryn had already taken the biggest risk by joining the Galactic Alliance, and now it was time to make that alliance meaningful by building genuine connections between individuals and not just maintaining diplomatic relations between governments. Maya concluded by saying that she had come to their world not as an expert or a diplomat, but as a young person who believed in the possibility of a better future. And she asked the Council to join her in that belief and to invest in programs that would bring Kryn youth together with young people from other worlds, and she promised that such investments would pay dividends in understanding and cooperation for generations to come. The chamber fell silent when she finished, and for a moment, Maya worried that she had overstepped or offended the Council, and then one of the eldest Council members stood and began to speak in the clicking language of the Kryn, and Maya's translator implant converted the words, and she heard him say that he had doubted the wisdom of allowing a human youth to address them. But now, he saw that wisdom came from experience rather than age, and Maya had earned the right to speak through her courage and her work. Other Council members spoke in support, and by the end of the session, the Council voted unanimously to establish new youth exchange programs and to fund Maya's organization with substantial resources, and to send Kryn students to study on Earth and other human worlds. And Maya felt tears of joy as she realized that her speech had achieved more than she dared hope. After the formal session ended, several Council members approached Maya privately to tell her that her words had touched them deeply, and one elderly female named Matron Kess said that Maya reminded her of her own granddaughter who had died, defending a mixed species colony, and that she saw in Maya the same spirit of hope and determination, and that gave her faith in the future. The threatened attack never materialized, and security forces later discovered that the extremist group had been infiltrated and their plans disrupted before they could act, and Marcus told Maya that sometimes the best defense was to proceed as if the threats didn't exist, and show that fear wouldn't stop the work of building a better future, and Maya agreed, feeling grateful that she had trusted her instincts. That evening there was a celebration in Maya's honor, and young Kryn performed traditional dances and music and shared food from their culture, and Maya participated enthusiastically, trying everything, and learning the basic steps of their dances and making everyone laugh with her attempts to reproduce the clicking sounds of their language. And the atmosphere was joyful and hopeful, and exactly what Maya had envisioned when she started. Her work Zax pulled Maya aside during the celebration and told her that she had accomplished something historic, and that the Council's decision would change everything for young Kryn, and already he was receiving messages from across the planet, from young people who wanted to participate in exchange programs and learn about other species. And Maya smiled, saying that was just the beginning, and they had so much more work to do. When Maya and Marcus prepared to leave the Kryn homeworld, they were seen off by hundreds of young Kryn who had gathered at the landing platform, and they chanted a traditional blessing that wished travelers safe journeys and promised that they would be remembered, and Maya felt overwhelmed by the warmth and acceptance, and she promised to return soon, and to continue working to strengthen the bonds between their peoples. On the journey back to the station, Marcus told Maya that what she had accomplished on the Kryn homeworld would have lasting effects, and that she had changed the trajectory of human-Kryn relations in ways that would benefit both species for generations. And Maya said she couldn't have done it without his support and without the example he had set for her, and that together, they were building the future her mother had died defending. Back at her station, Maya found messages waiting from across the galaxy, and leaders from other species wanted to invite her to their worlds, and youth groups wanted to join her network, and media outlets wanted to interview her, and she realized that her work had reached a tipping point and was now growing faster than she could manage alone, and she would need to expand her team and develop new structures to handle the scale of what was happening. Rachel and Kira and other close friends agreed to take on more responsibility, and together they created a leadership council that would guide the organization's growth and ensure that it stayed true to its mission of building bridges and fostering understanding. And Maya felt grateful to have such dedicated people working with her, and she knew that the organization would outlast her own involvement and continue making a difference long into the future. One message stood out from all the others, and it was from a young human named Jake who lived on a remote mining colony. And he wrote that he had grown up believing that aliens were dangerous and that integration was wrong, but he had watched Maya's speech to the Kryn High Council, and something about her words had made him question everything he had been taught, and now he wanted to learn more, and maybe even join her organization. Maya wrote back immediately, welcoming Jake and offering to connect him with other young people who were questioning the prejudices they had inherited, and she told him that change was always possible, and that she respected his courage in reaching out and asking questions, and she promised that he would find a community of support in her network. And over the following weeks, Jake became one of the most active participants and eventually a vocal advocate for integration. 2 years had passed since that terrible night on the platform, and Maya was now 19 years old and recognized across the galaxy as one of the leading voices for integration and cooperation, and her organization had grown to include chapters on over 300 worlds and had connected millions of young people from hundreds of different species, and the impact was visible in changing attitudes and increasing cooperation between governments and peoples. Marcus had been promoted to Admiral and now commanded an entire battle group, but he still made time to visit Maya regularly, and they maintained their close relationship despite the demands of their respective duties, and he watched with pride as his daughter became a figure of galactic importance and knew that she had far exceeded anything he had accomplished in his military career. The Galactic Council nominated Maya for their highest civilian honor and the Medal of Unity, which had only been awarded 7 times in the history of the Alliance, and at 19 she would be the youngest recipient by far, and the ceremony was scheduled to take place on Earth in New Atlanta, at the very platform where her journey had begun. Maya insisted on holding the ceremony there despite security concerns because she wanted to reclaim that space and transform it from a place of fear and hatred into a symbol of hope and resilience, and the city agreed and began preparations for what would be the largest gathering of galactic leaders Earth had ever hosted. In the days before the ceremony, Maya walked the platform alone, thinking about everything that had happened since that night, and she could still feel the ghost of fear from being bound to the support beam and waiting for the train, and she remembered the terror and the despair, and the moment when her father had appeared like an avenging angel and saved her life. But she also thought about everything that had come after, and the friendships she had formed and the barriers she had helped break down, and the young people across the galaxy who had found courage through her example, and she realized that what had seemed like the worst moment of her life had actually been the beginning of something beautiful and meaningful. The ceremony drew representatives from every member species of the Galactic Alliance, and the platform was decorated with symbols from hundreds of worlds, and the crowd that gathered included humans and Vexnar and Kryn and astral beings and dozens of other species, all coming together to honor a young woman who had shown them what was possible. When people chose hope over fear, Marcus stood in his dress uniform watching as various speakers praised Maya's accomplishments and her dedication to building bridges and her courage in facing threats and challenges, and he felt emotion welling up inside him. And he thought about his wife and wished she could be there to see their daughter receiving such recognition. When it was Maya's turn to speak, she approached the podium where she had once been tied and helpless, and she looked out at the assembled crowd, seeing so many friends and allies, and she began by thanking everyone who had supported her work, and specifically mentioned her father, whose example had taught her what it meant to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. She said that 2 years ago on this very spot, she had faced the ugliest side of humanity, and she had been targeted for the color of her skin, and for daring to believe that different species could work together, and she had nearly died because of that hatred, but she had survived, and she had made a choice about how to respond, and she had chosen to believe that the Morris and Bennett and Sullivan of the galaxy were a loud minority, and that most people, regardless of species, wanted peace and cooperation and understanding. Maya continued saying that the past 2 years had proven her right, and she had met thousands of young people who rejected the prejudices of previous generations and who were building friendships across species boundaries and creating a future where diversity was celebrated rather than feared. And she told the crowd that they were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history, which was a truly integrated civilization built on mutual respect and shared values. She acknowledged that there was still much work to do, and that extremism and hatred hadn't disappeared, and probably never would completely. But she said that every young person who chose cooperation over conflict, and every friendship formed across species lines, and every program that brought different peoples together, was a victory against those forces, and together they were building momentum that would be impossible to stop. Maya concluded her speech by saying that she accepted the Medal of Unity, not for herself, but on behalf of all the young people across the galaxy who were doing the hard work of building bridges, and she dedicated the award to her mother, who had died defending a vision of a better future, and to her father who had saved her life and taught her what courage looked like, and to all the friends and allies who had joined her in this mission. The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, and he saw similar emotion on the faces of those around him, and delegates from species that had historically been enemies stood side by side applauding this young human woman who had somehow brought them together, and he knew that this moment would be remembered as a turning point in galactic history. After the ceremony ended, there was a reception, and Maya was surrounded by well-wishers and people wanting to congratulate her and share their own stories. But eventually she managed to slip away and find her father, and they stood together at the edge of the platform, looking out at the city below and the stars above. Marcus said he was proud of her, and that was an understatement, and Maya leaned against him, saying she couldn't have done any of it without him. And he shook his head, telling her that she had done this herself, and he had just been there to support her, and she had taken a terrible experience and transformed it into something beautiful, and that took a strength and vision that came from within her alone. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the twin suns begin to set and paint the sky in brilliant colors. And finally Maya said that sometimes she still had nightmares about that night, and about the feeling of helplessness and fear. But then she would wake up and remember everything that had come after, and she would feel grateful because that terrible experience had given her a purpose and shown her what she was capable of. Marcus understood, saying that trauma was like that, and it never completely went away, but you could choose what to do with it, and you could let it destroy you, or you could use it as fuel to build something better. And Maya had chosen the harder path, but the one that honored both her own pain and the suffering of others, who had faced similar hatred, and that was the mark of true courage. As darkness fell and the stars became visible, Maya thought about all the worlds out there and all the young people working to build a better future, and she felt connected to them across the vast distances of space, and she knew that the work would continue long after she was gone, and that each generation would face its own challenges and make its own choices about what kind of galaxy they wanted to live in. But she also knew that the foundation had been laid, and that millions of young people now understood that cooperation was possible, and that diversity made them stronger rather than weaker, and that fear and hatred were choices that could be rejected, and that gave her hope for the future, and confidence that humanity and all the species of the galaxy would continue to grow and evolve together. Marcus put his arm around Maya, and together they watched as the city lights began to twinkle below them, and ships of a dozen different designs moved through the sky, and the platform that had once been a place of terror was now filled with people from across the galaxy, celebrating unity and hope. And he thought about how far they had all come and how much further they would go. Maya whispered, "Humanity. Fuck yeah." And Marcus smiled and repeated, "Humanity, fuck yeah." And they both knew that this phrase meant more than just pride in their own species, and it meant pride in what humanity had chosen to become, and in their willingness to reach beyond their own kind and embrace the infinite diversity of the cosmos, and in their refusal to let fear dictate their future. And as father and daughter stood together on that platform under the vast canopy of stars, they represented the best of what humanity could be, and a species that had learned from its mistakes and chosen to build rather than destroy, and to unite rather than divide, and to face the future with courage and hope. and that choice made all the difference in the galaxy they were creating together.